In this video, we'll explore some intriguing facets of the brain's twin hemispheres, while offering some different insights that stem from a fresh interpretation of Hegel's philosophy. We will also examine the importance of the use of metaphors we choose to understand the brain and the mind, all in an attempt to revitalize the current narrative. But first, I would like to make two important disclaimers. The following material may sound unusual coming from an AI-generated voice, as it delves into discussions about consciousness and the human brain, as well as interesting human traits. As amazing as it is, AI is just another beneficial tool, that's all. This content has been meticulously compiled by the author of this channel, Richard D. Galley. While it may seem ironic, the reality is that AI's advancement is unstoppable. Thus, like countless others, this author engages with it as part of the evolving world. Additionally, there are some matters worthy of a warning concerning AI that will be addressed in this video. Secondly, the ideas of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel have often been associated with ideologies such as Marxism and Fascism. These interpretations of Hegel's work are different compared to the perspective presented in this material. While Hegel's philosophy has been claimed by various political movements, the approach in this video focuses on a different aspect of his thought, aiming to explore his ideas on consciousness, spirit, and the development of culture in a way that transcends those ideological frameworks. Now, let's dive into our main topic. It could be said that the difficulty with which we find ourselves at this stage in history is that, on one hand, religion is currently responsible for the many problems we are experiencing today. However, at the same time, religion is an essential facet of the human psyche. It's unavoidable. It's the one aspect of all societies that enables a cohesive culture. Even for the atheists, they may conclude that we as a society no longer need religion. But they don't seem to realize that religion has a lot to do with building the very society they are glad to be a part of. I think of this as the Nietzschean Dilemma, where we are damned whether we follow religion or not, as it seems. Given this situation, what course of action should we pursue? On one hand, Nietzsche's perspective suggests that creating a new religion is unlikely to succeed. The Christian Judeo belief system has deeply influenced our collective consciousness for centuries, making it challenging to establish any alternative faith. Additionally, inventing a new religion isn't as simple as devising random beliefs and calling it as such. Religions emerge from ideas that resonate with people at specific times in history and must be seen as genuine truths. They must not only be considered true, but also morally virtuous, blending goodness and truth seamlessly. On the other hand, as difficult or indeed impossible as this may seem, there might be a course of action that we can consider to pursue. As every point in history is unique to the people during their time, today we find ourselves in a distinct situation vastly different from those of the past. We have developed something that might have been a part of our ancestors' understanding, but not as refined as what we now possess, that being science. To elucidate this endeavor, let's delve into insights regarding how the brain functions. This unavoidably lengthy quote from Iain McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, sheds light on key aspects that can help us recognize why we feel somewhat stuck in our current situation. Quote, "The conclusion, therefore, is devoted to the world we now inhabit. Here I suggest that it is as if the left hemisphere, which creates a sort of self-reflexive virtual world, has blocked off the available exits, the ways out of the hall of mirrors, into a reality which the right hemisphere could enable us to understand. In the past, this tendency was counterbalanced by forces from outside the enclosed system of the self-conscious mind, apart from the history incarnated in our culture and the natural world itself, from both of which we are increasingly alienated. These were principally the embodied nature of our existence, the arts and religion. In our time, each of these has been subverted, and the routes of escape from the virtual world have been closed off. an increasingly mechanistic, fragmented, decontextualized world marked by unwarranted optimism mixed with paranoia and a feeling of emptiness has come about, reflecting, I believe, the unopposed action of a dysfunctional left hemisphere. Let us remind ourselves of the neurological literature for a moment. Although the left hemisphere does not see and cannot understand what the right hemisphere understands, it is expert at pretending that it does, at finding quite plausible but bogus explanations for the evidence that does not fit its version of events. It will be remembered from the experiments of Deglin and Kinsborn that the left hemisphere would rather believe authority than the evidence of its own senses. And remember how it is willing to deny a paralyzed limb even when it is confronted with indisputable evidence. Ramachandran puts the problem with his customary vividness. In the most extreme cases, a patient will not only deny that the arm or leg is paralyzed, but assert that the arm lying in the bed next to him, his own paralyzed arm, doesn't belong to him. There's an unbridled willingness to accept absurd ideas. But when the damage is to the left hemisphere, and the sufferer is therefore depending on the right hemisphere, with paralysis on the body's right side, they almost never experience denial. Why not? They are as disabled and frustrated as people with right hemisphere damage, and presumably there is as much need for psychological defense, but in fact they are not only aware of the paralysis, but constantly talk about it. It is the vehemence of the denial, not a mere indifference to paralysis, that cries out for an explanation. Again, Nietzsche had the measure of it. "I have done that," says my veridical episodic right hemisphere memory. On the other hand, "I cannot have done that," says my pride, theory-driven, denial-prone left hemisphere, and remains adamant. At last, memory yields. The left hemisphere is not keen on taking responsibility. If the defect might reflect on the self, it does not like to accept it. But if something or someone else can be made to take responsibility, if it is a victim of someone else's wrongdoing, then it is prepared to do so. Ramachandran carried out an experiment in which a patient with denial of a left arm paralysis received an injection of harmless salt water that she was told would paralyze her, but in reality, already paralyzed left arm. Once her left hemisphere had someone else to blame for it, it was prepared to accept the existence of the paralysis. Ramachandran again. The left hemisphere is a conformist, largely indifferent to discrepancies, whereas the right hemisphere is the opposite, highly sensitive to perturbation. The left hemisphere's denial, a tendency to conformism, a willingness to disregard the evidence, a habit of ducking responsibility, a blindness to mere experience in the face of the overwhelming evidence of theory. These might sound ominously familiar to observers of contemporary Western life. We can also make a connection here with a rather fundamental difference between the hemispheres. The left hemisphere's stickiness, its tendency to recur to what it is familiar with, tends to reinforce whatever it is already doing. It only discovers more of what it already knows, and it only does more of what it already is doing. The right hemisphere, by contrast, seeing more of the picture and taking a broader perspective that characteristically includes both its own and the left hemispheres, is more reciprocally inclined and more likely to espouse another point of view. One way of thinking of this is in terms of feedback systems. Most biological systems seek homeostasis. If they move too far in one direction, they stabilize themselves by self-correction. This is negative feedback, the most familiar example of which is the operation of a thermostat. If the temperature constantly tends to drop, the thermostat triggers a heating system that will act to bring the temperature back to the desired level. However, systems can become unstable and enter a situation in which positive feedback obtains. In other words, a move in one direction, rather than producing a move in the opposite direction, serves to promote further moves in the same direction, and a snowballing effect occurs. The right hemisphere, then, is capable of freeing us through negative feedback. The left hemisphere tends to positive feedback, and we can become stuck. You might think that as brains evolved to become larger, the interhemispheric connections would increase in tandem. But not at all. They actually decrease relative to brain size. The bigger the brain, the less interconnected it is. Rather than taking the opportunity to increase connectedness, evolution appears to be moving in the opposite direction. And there is a close relationship between the separation of the hemispheres on the one hand and the development of something that keeps cropping up in this unfolding story: the asymmetry of the hemispheres. Because it turns out that the greater the brain asymmetry, the smaller the corpus callosum, suggesting that the evolution both of brain size and of hemisphere asymmetry went hand in hand with a reduction in interhemispheric connectivity. And, in the ultimate case of the modern human brain, its twin hemispheres have been characterized as two autonomous systems. Ultimately, the principle of division, that of the left hemisphere, and the principle of union, that of the right hemisphere, need to be unified. In Hegel's terms, the thesis and antithesis must be enabled to achieve a synthesis on a higher level. End quote. Now, armed with this information, pun intended, it's important to note, perhaps surprisingly to some, that the left and right hemispheres of the brain can be correlated with the left and right spectrums of the political systems in the West. The right tends to align with conservative values, while the left is propelled by its drive to progress at any cost.
You know, when I use the terms left and right hemisphere, people think I'm using them metaphorically, but all these things are based on actual either experiments or on observation of patients who've got damage to one or other hemisphere. But the left hemisphere perseverates, which is a technical term in neurology, which means it carries on answering the same thing in the same way,
Wow.
never wishing to change. And brings the same mindset to everything. You ask them to do a different question, and they bring the same mindset from the last question. So there are just so many aspects of the way the world is now, which reflect a sort of right hemisphere brain damage. I can't put it, differently from that. That's how we now are. We're becoming more and more like machines, which is how the left hemisphere on its own thinks of itself and thinks of the world. So people who've got no functioning right hemisphere tend to see people as either robots or zombies, for example, which of course have become fashionable things to debate in philosophy. And a lot of philosophy, I'm afraid, is very captured by the left hemisphere at the expense of the wisdom the right hemisphere might have opened up.
Would that be a sign of narcissism, to see the rest of the world as potentially robots?
No, I wouldn't say that exactly. No, it's a terrible distortion in which you no longer can see what life is. But narcissism is another aspect of left hemisphere capture.
So let's go over the key aspects that seem to relate to why we may feel somewhat stuck, in point form. 1. The left hemisphere creates a virtual world, blocking exits to reality. External forces that once balanced self-consciousness, such as culture, the natural world itself, and religion, are diminishing. 2. Due to the left hemisphere's dominance, a world has emerged that is less thought of as organic, but more mechanistic, fragmented, decontextualized, and marked by unwarranted optimism mixed with paranoia and a feeling of emptiness. 3. The left hemisphere is adept at convincing itself that it understands what the right hemisphere comprehends. It excels at fabricating plausible yet false explanations for evidence that doesn't align with its version of events. 4. The left hemisphere is prone to denial, unwilling to accept responsibility. 5. Denial diminishes when the left hemisphere can blame external factors. 6. The left hemisphere is conformist, indifferent to discrepancies, while the right hemisphere is sensitive to anomalies. 7. The left hemisphere reinforces familiarity, while the right hemisphere is more reciprocal and open to other viewpoints. 8. The right hemisphere can free us through negative feedback, while the left hemisphere tends towards positive feedback, which is to say that we not only become stuck, but things will get worse exponentially. 9. The principle of division, that of the left hemisphere, and the principle of union, that of the right hemisphere, need to be unified. And finally, evolution has led to decreased interhemispheric connectivity despite larger brain size. And in the case of the modern human brain, the twin hemispheres have been characterized as two autonomous systems. The last two key points are of particular interest. Even though the principle of division has its use, this, as the left hemisphere's way of looking at the world alone, would obviously be insufficient. But together with the right hemisphere's propensity for unification, as a working whole, this would not only be sufficient but yield success. In fact, in my estimation, this would unlock the individual's full potential. But alas, evolution has more in store for us. While we see there is the need for a more balanced and nuanced connection between the differences of the hemispheres, evolution is pushing us further as we evolve. One could say that existence is playing an unfortunate joke on us by continually moving the goalposts. But on the other hand, this would be the very process needed to produce a more evolved brain. I am definitely inclined to think the latter, as it makes sense and stands to reason, that if both hemispheres are destined to become two autonomous systems, as long as we continue to consciously work at keeping a balance between their differences and working together in unity, we would indeed evolve into a higher state of consciousness. This is where I propose we can apply Hegel's philosophy. As we've already explored in the first video of this playlist, Hegel provides an antidote to this very situation. Given the correlation between the brain hemispheres, the inner self, and external factors such as politics and cultural relationships between people, what Hegel terms the universal, the solution becomes apparent. The title of this video, Incorporating Hegel's Philosophy Beyond Marxism and Fascism with New Insights and Attempt to Revitalize Our Narrative, hints at what I'm about to propose. First, let's examine what one might consider to be the essential prerequisites for a revitalized narrative. To begin with, it's important to remember that for Hegel, the absence of an ethical whole is the soil out of which culture grows. So one shouldn't lose heart because of our current situation. But in fact, this is a good thing. Culture speaks clearly of the divide between individuality and universality. Remember that for Hegel, we're talking about the idea of culture, a construct that we posit ourselves. He says it's that which consists precisely in being conscious of two different worlds and which embraces both. It's both external and internal, but because it's an idea, the external is internal too. It's the self's alienation from itself, positing its own negation as outside of itself but as part of its ethical constitution. Hegel writes, "Nothing has a spirit that is grounded within itself, an indwelling, but each is outside itself in something alien." Or, in other words, nothing has a spirit that is grounded within itself, which is how the left hemisphere operates, as it creates a sort of self-reflexive virtual world and blocks off the ways out of the hall of mirrors, following its principle of division. On the other hand, the divide between individuality and universality, the idea of culture, a construct that we posit ourselves and consists precisely in being conscious of two different worlds and embracing both, is how the right hemisphere sees the world, following its principle of unification. The question that arises then is regarding Nietzsche's declaration that creating a new religion is unlikely to succeed because the Christian Judeo-belief system has deeply influenced our collective consciousness. But if you recall, Hegel had the antidote for this as well, by using the dialectical process that not only results in a new construct, but one that is higher and richer than the preceding one. It may negate or oppose the preceding concept to a certain extent, but the key here is that it also contains it, which is what Hegel refers to as sublation. Sublation involves a form of cancelling, but at the same time to preserve and to lift up. It's the process through which the negation, the element that negates the positive definition of the concept, is included in a new form of the concept. Hegel describes it as the negation of negation, or determinate negation. So here, if we are to implement Hegel's philosophy, we can avoid Nietzsche's concern by evolving existing religions and cultures, rather than inventing new ones. This has happened before, as in the case of St. Thomas Aquinas, whose extensive writings explored the relationship between the mind of man and the mind of God, and his synthesis of knowledge relating to this joining of intellect and religious belief. Thomas Aquinas was considered the greatest of the scholastic philosophers. He produced a comprehensive synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy that influenced Roman Catholic doctrine for centuries, and was adopted as the official philosophy of the Church in 1917. This also answers the next question concerning the idea that religion cannot be merely a collection of arbitrary beliefs. It must arise from ideas that resonate with people and be perceived as both true and morally virtuous, seamlessly blending goodness and truth. Therefore, a revitalized narrative must not simply contradict existing teachings, but instead shed new light on them that would produce a deeper understanding. Furthermore, a revitalized narrative must pass another test. For a narrative to be considered both true and good, it must not only offer a deeper, more meaningful rhetoric, but also a practical explanation for serious unanswered questions we hold to this day. For example, if there is a God, why does he allow so much suffering in the world? The old answer to this was to say that the earthly realm is fundamentally evil. Another question needing a better answer, which still seems to elude us today, is the meaning of life. Or, is there a reason for the existence of the universe? For that matter, why is there anything at all? Have you ever experienced a child beginning to ask clever questions and then it turns into a playful game? Questions that may not be as difficult as those just mentioned, but children can sometimes display incredible insights for their age. The questioning often starts simply by asking why something is the case. After you answer, they ask why again, about the explanation you just provided. You might then offer a reasonable answer to that, but they continue to ask why for every subsequent answer. It might seem like a fun game the child is playing, but it's interesting to see how quickly an adult becomes stuck and feels somewhat less knowledgeable, because in the child's eyes, you can't offer any satisfactory answers anymore. To borrow a quote from Einstein, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. This would be another essential test for a new narrative to pass. A good narrative should offer hope and inspiration for both adults and children, providing a foundation with a structure that not only permits, but also needs the manifestation of inspired ideas. In other words, it should ignite an inner spark into a flame within the individual. With adequate care, this narrative would not only allow, but actively encourage individuals to reach their ultimate potential. Opposed to the old narrative, which, while providing a foundation and structure that have guided us so far, tends to instill fear of God and enforce a fanatical rule of obedience. This rule, from on high, has enabled many to speak in God's name and commit heinous acts. In this sense, the new narrative would simply negate such teachings, but not without a good explanation that stems from the logic and reason within the narrative itself. The next test for a revitalized narrative to pass is that it has to be acceptable for the theist as well as the atheist. This seemingly impossible task isn't impossible at all, and again, it is achieved by Hegel with his observation on what spirit is. As philosopher R.C. Solomon concluded, what becomes evident from Hegel's writings is that Geist or spirit refers to a kind of shared or common general consciousness that is present in all individuals. Given that Hegel might have never agreed that there is a possibility that God does not exist, nevertheless, his philosophy regarding spirit as a phenomenon alone, by definition, allows it. To further explain, I would like to share a quote from the Bible. When Jesus returned to the disciples after he rose from the tomb and was about to leave them, they became concerned that they would be lost without him. John 14:26. Jesus replied, "The Advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will remind you of everything I have told you. For the atheist who cannot believe that Jesus rose from the dead on faith alone, there is often a tendency to dismiss all associated ideas outright. It's fair to reject the notion that such an event occurred due to a lack of empirical evidence. However, it's important not to discard valuable concepts entirely, as there is evidence for and an understanding of a kind of shared or common general consciousness, or in other words, a spirit, that is present in all individuals, as R.C. Solomon described, suggesting, I would argue, that many ideas within religious teachings hold significant insights and relevance. That is to say, yes, there is no evidence for a God, as the atheist would see it, because it's an immaterial concept. But we can identify our brain, the mind, and consciousness, regardless of what came first. There is a physical mental phenomenon that can be studied. One might conclude that atheism or scientific-mindedness aligns more with the left hemisphere's way of looking at the world, which tends to deny or overlook parts of a concept it doesn't recognize. Interestingly, during the Age of Enlightenment, the roles appeared to be reversed. It was the religious-minded who often denied the emerging scientific discoveries, denial being a characteristic of the left hemisphere. While during the Enlightenment, Romanticism with a heartfelt desire to discover more of what the world had to offer was the sentiment. But at this point in history, science seems to hold the perspective from the left hemisphere. This makes sense even if we remember the well-established discovery that the left hemisphere is the area of the brain that has a lot to do with speech, whereas the right hemisphere is somewhat silent. One is explicit, the other is implicit. Another way the hemispheres differ is by not thinking about what a hemisphere is, but rather how it operates. As McGilchrist mentions while discussing Descartes, quote, Descartes was right. The one undeniable fact is our consciousness. He was wrong, however. Most would now agree to think of mind and body as two separate substances, two whats. This was, I believe, a typical product of a certain way of thinking which I suggest is characteristic of the brain's left hemisphere, a concern with the whatness of things, where it was so obviously a matter of two hownesses, as the right hemisphere would see it. End quote. Now that we have discussed some prerequisites for a narrative, we can move on to outline a few more general points. Since this will make the video quite lengthy, I will continue to highlight additional points in the following video. Section 1. Some may say that what I am proposing, including my perspective on Hegel, sounds akin to the recently popular New Age movement, as one commentator remarked. In a way, that's right, but there is a big difference. I am aware of this movement, and the reason it may sound somewhat hippie-like is that I reference Romanticism at times and talk about consciousness and unity. Those who dismiss this as mumbo-jumbo likely lean towards a left-brain orientation and believe that we are nothing more than robots made of flesh. In this view, consciousness is purely a product of the brain, subject to causes and effects beyond our understanding, and therefore we have no free will. Others might turn to ideologies like Marxism or communism and prefer being ruled by a government head. However, from my observation, these perspectives align more with the New Age movement than one might expect. The narrative of being a robot without free will leads to the belief that you have no control over what you can do, and that you are merely moved around by outside forces, absolving you of responsibility for your actions. Similarly, the New Age movement offers teachings that relinquish responsibility by wishing for something to manifest or expect a God to do the work. Overly scientific-mindedness or scientism, Marxism, and fanatical religions, as well as so-called New Age beliefs, share a common trait. They all tend to depend on something external to do the work, instead of the individual taking the initiative. On the other hand, what I am proposing is very different. As you might have figured out, I am not depending on a God to do anything for me. and definitely not wanting a government head to tell me what I can or must do, akin to living in a totalitarian regime. Whether there is a God or not, there is a tangible sense of spirit within, which is something even an atheist can recognize. And here, God leaves everything up to us. As was reflected in what Jesus told the disciples in John 14, when he was about to leave them, as he said, "Spirit will teach you all things and remind you of everything I have told you." In other words, it's all up to us now. The logic here is that when you take full responsibility for your actions by accepting free will, Spirit is also free to emanate through you. Indeed, this is the only way it can. Spirit operates through our desires and passions. Hegel explains this in his philosophy of history. As he said, passion is, in the first instance, the subjective and therefore formal aspect of energy, will, and activity. Passions, by which I mean the specific inclinations of character, as long as these inclinations go beyond private interests and provide the driving force for actions that benefit the broader community. In other words, to be truly passionate about accomplishing a desired goal means you can tap into a source of energy to achieve it. However, if this goal is for your own personal benefit alone, you may very well achieve it. But if you recall, nothing has a spirit that is grounded within itself, which is how the left hemisphere alone operates, as it creates a sort of self-reflexive virtual world, blocking off reality. Following this principle of division, spirit would be limited. Therefore, for spirit to truly manifest, it has to achieve something of benefit to the broader community, following the principle of unification, which is how the right hemisphere sees the world. With this goal, spirit, as it is a shared form of consciousness, would be at work to its fullest capacity. This might be why many who achieve their personal goals of becoming rich, reaching high status, or seeking lasting recognition often feel empty inside at the end of the day. This emptiness stems from a lack of spirit in their endeavors. On the other hand, the best example of spirit manifesting today would be to ask, who is working on a goal that has the intention of achieving something of benefit to the broader community and benefiting as many as possible over the longest period of time? That would be Elon Musk and his continual development of SpaceX, with the intention of ensuring the continual existence of humanity by eventually inhabiting Mars. Section 2. It's all too easy to come to the conclusion that consciousness is the product of the brain, leading to the idea that we are robotic by nature. As far back as the Industrial Revolution, it was all too easy to compare the marvel of complicated machinery with how the brain and body work. And even before that, in 1753, William Blackstone, in his opening chapters from his commentaries on the laws of England, used a clock as a metaphor to describe how God created the universe. As he wrote, when God put matter into motion, he established certain laws of motion to which all movable bodies must conform. And, to descend from the greatest operations to the smallest, when a workman forms a clock or other piece of mechanism, he establishes, at his own pleasure, certain arbitrary laws for its direction. Today, 270 years later, we have gained a considerable wealth of knowledge regarding the mind and the brain, including but not limited to what McGilchrist and others have shown us. But as we are aware, there is a new device we often use as a metaphor for today, not so much a mechanical but a digital device, the computer. This is evident in the belief that AI could actually become conscious. I have discussed this in a post on my blog called, "Why is there talk about consciousness and AI?" In short, artificial intelligence can mimic consciousness, pass the Turing test, and become faster and more precise than a human, but that doesn't mean it can ever surpass human consciousness. The discussion we are having about spirit is the point I wish to make. A computer can never become conscious, because by definition, spirit's drive through our passions and desires can only manifest through the human individual. As I said in my disclaimer at the beginning of this video, that I believe AI is a good thing only as a tool for humans, and that this material has been put together very carefully by a human being. This brings us to my next point. If one thinks of the mind-body relationship by using a computer as a metaphor, then in that case AI may become a problem. If you recall, I said that this way of thinking leads to denying responsibility and a lack of initiative. Together with the belief that we do not possess free will and therefore look for something external to demand what one can or must do, then the problem will not stem from AI itself, but from the humans behind it. The importance of the way we use metaphors is explained by Iain McGilchrist, as he said, "The model we choose to use to understand something determines what we find. If it is the case that our understanding is an effect of the metaphors we choose, it is also true that it is a cause. Our understanding itself guides the choice of metaphor by which we understand it. The chosen metaphor is both cause and effect of the relationship. Thus, how we think about ourselves and our relationship to the world is already revealed in the metaphors we unconsciously choose to talk about. That choice further entrenches our partial view of the subject. Paradoxically, we seem to be obliged to understand something, including ourselves, well enough to choose the appropriate model before we can understand it. Our first leap determines where we land. If we assume a purely mechanical universe and take the machine as our model, we will uncover the view that, surprise, surprise, the body, and the brain with it, is a machine." End quote. There are finer, simpler, and above all, more beautiful metaphors we could use to replace this mechanical, digital view of ourselves and our relationship with the universe, by comparing spirit, or, as I liken it, the spirit of life, with metaphors that exist in the living organic world. For example, to use a stream or river as a metaphor, the water comes from high up from a mountain and flows through the land until it reaches the sea. On the water's journey, it has to navigate the terrain. The water may meet obstacles, such as a hill in a valley, but the force behind the water is powerful enough to overcome it. Then, as the water reaches flatter land, a phenomenon occurs. It turns and weaves its way through the land, resulting in what is known as oxbow-shaped meanders. The river displays two types of curves, one curving away from the straight path of the river and one curving back, eventually leaving an oxbow lake behind. The lake forms as the river finds a different, shorter course. Then the river reaches the sea, where the sun's heat evaporates the water, which turns into clouds. Then winds move the clouds back over the mountain, and the mountain forces the clouds higher into the atmosphere until it rains, starting the cycle all over again. I'm not aware of this metaphor being used before, but it came to mind after thinking about another simple metaphor that I'll share afterward. Upon contemplating this one, I was amazed at how well it describes how and why spirit moves. To begin, the water comes from a mountain, like spirit comes from on high, and then the river is able to overcome small hills in a valley, just like spirit has enough power to overcome obstacles on our personal journey. Then, as the river reaches flatter land, it begins to bend and weave, resulting in meanders that after a considerable length of time produce oxbow-shaped lakes that eventually dry out. This part of the metaphor seems to describe how spirit moves by the dialectical method or determinate negation. The river displays two types of curves, one curving away from the straight path, and one curving back to the river's original path as it goes on its journey, just as spirit is confronted by the world that negates it. Then, as the river continues on its now more direct path, an oxbow-shaped lake is left behind. Just like spirit moving over time by way of sublation, it is still the same river, but there are some parts that are left behind. And over time, these lakes, or ideas, eventually dry up. The next metaphor I would like to share is one that I have heard before. The intention for the metaphor was to describe why people enjoy going to musical festivals, or any sort of festival that ends up in a large crowd. At such an event, people become highly spirited, and their sense of belonging increases. In that sense, it is describing spirit in general. Spirit is similar to the phenomenon of a coal fire. When there is a pile of burning coal, it burns at its best and can sustain heat for a long time. But when a rock of coal is on its own, it will begin to lose its heat and, in a short amount of time, become cold enough to pick up. This is a good metaphor to describe how spirit is dependent on the unification of many different sources of heat, where the spark within the individual ignites into a burning flame. This metaphor may also describe the phenomenon associated with the power of a mob, as seen in the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany and communism in Russia, as well as earlier in the French Revolution and the subsequent reign of terror, which saw public executions and mass killings of thousands of counter-revolutionary suspects, due to a lack of further writings by Hegel, whose life was cut short by cholera or some other gastrointestinal disease at the age of 61. We will never know whether he was about to offer a solution to the problem of mob rule. Nevertheless, it was a significant factor in much of history, and he never addressed this negative aspect of spirit or how to avoid it. Many Hegelians may accept this as simply the way of the world. If this is the case, we must go beyond even Hegel to address this problem in a way that aligns with spirit. I have spoken extensively on this in my previous video, a new narrative based on natural law. Natural law is an ambiguous topic, as it has been interpreted in many ways by different people throughout history. However, few interpretations address it in a way that relates to spirit. A new narrative based on natural law is a summary of a 9-hour presentation by Mark Passio. This presentation resonates with me because it explains the laws of nature from both an interpersonal perspective and an external perspective, with a set of principles that align with what initially attracted me to Hegel's philosophy. This dual set of principles, addressing both the subjective and the universal aspects of natural law, provides a foundation and structure that ultimately align with the manifestation of spirit. Within this framework, the negative behaviors associated with mob rule would not occur. This would not be due to a police state enforcing order, but rather because the general population would have no desire to engage in such actions in the first place. The violence of mob rule stems from prolonged oppression, where the spirit of the people has been ignored long enough to eventually erupt violently, similar to a dam holding back a river that finally collapses, causing destruction. In contrast, if spirit is allowed to flow freely, as in the earlier river metaphor, such violence and destruction would never occur. Section 3. Regarding the God debate, the theist is kidding himself or herself when talking as if they comprehend God, describing God as a personal, finite being. And the atheist shouldn't entertain the idea that they do understand God and enter a debate. In a revealing article called Hegel's God, Robert Wallace describes a little-known alternative divinity. We see that how we consider God falls short, beyond belief. In his article, he says that Hegel begins with a radical critique of conventional ways of thinking about God. God is commonly described as a being who is omniscient, omnipotent, and so forth. Hegel says this is already a mistake. If God is to be truly infinite, truly unlimited, then God cannot be a being, because a being, that is, one being, however powerful among others, is already limited by its relations to the others. To think of God as a being is to render God finite. Furthermore, in the opening section of this article, Wallace explains why Hegel isn't as popular as he should be, as he wrote. Hegel has addressed the issue of God, but has been left out of the usual discussions. There are a few reasons for this. Hegel's philosophy is difficult to understand due to his complex writing style and the various misleading rumors associated with his name. Karl Marx claimed Hegel as a significant influence, leading many believers to distance themselves from Hegel since Marx was an atheist. Conversely, Kierkegaard ridiculed Hegel for supposedly reducing faith to a dry and impenetrable rational system. Consequently, Hegel's philosophical theology has been caught between atheists who reject or downplay it and believers who find its terminology alien and off-putting. As a result, few commentators have had the sympathy to present it in an appealing way. Section 4. When it comes to the idea of faith, it's one thing to have faith in a God we claim to understand, portraying God as a finite being, and quite another when in reality we can't even begin to comprehend what God is as something infinite. Therefore, faith in both cases is somewhat redundant. On the contrary, faith could be utilized in another way. I usually say whether there is a God or not, because the fact is, we have little knowledge of what God is, but on the other hand, we can understand how God operates through spirit. So the faith one must have is in the ability to recognize and allow spirit to manifest through you. Having faith in yourself to ignite spirit's flame within and be courageous in achieving your goal becomes your greatest endeavor of a lifetime. And for those who are in line with religious teachings, make Jesus proud of you.